Welcome to the Hub Roundtable for the 23rd of May, 2025. I'm Rudyard Griffiths, publisher, joined by my co-founder and editor-at-large, Sean Speer. Well, Sean, it's not looking good here to see a Canadian team in the final for the Stanley Cup. What is happening with these teams that seem to just fall apart? I'm thinking of the Oilers here in these third periods. It's what did in the Leafs. It looks like a Canadian curse here on our best hockey teams that we have to offer in this competition.
Yeah, we're going to have to get one of our top-notch writers, maybe economist Trevor Toome, to write about the relationship between low taxes and coming back late in playoff games. You know, we know that low competitive taxation does a lot of things. I didn't realize that it correlates. Maybe it's causally related to the Dallas Stars and the Florida Panthers seemingly taking off in these conference finals.
Yeah, so for the uninitiated, what Sean's talking about is, I guess, the lack of state taxes. Is that it that makes these salaries just go that much farther? It's not simply the currency, the US dollar. Obviously, it's the fact that these players pay less taxes. So better players, hey, guess what? Want to go where they get to play and pay less taxes.
Yeah, at the end of last year's play, in all seriousness, at the end of last year's playoffs, Roger, there was some talk about whether teams in Texas and Florida in particular had a distinct advantage in the salary cap era when you're trying to stretch your dollars as far as you can. The NHL actually took this question up, and Commissioner Gary Bettman said that the league didn't intend to do anything to try to correct for this policy advantage that those franchises have. The fact that the same teams are back in the conference finals and are possibly poised to go to the Stanley Cup Finals once again means that this is probably an ongoing conversation. And as we've tried to convey at the Hub, if it's having this competitive effect in professional hockey, then we should be able to see how it could have positive effects in other parts of the economy as well when it comes to competing for engineers or lawyers or doctors or whatever. So in that sense, the Stanley Cup playoffs are operating at different levels. Some it gives you something for those hardcore fans, but for those wonks in our midst, there's also an interesting policy story.
Yeah. Tax competitiveness rears its ugly head
Yes.
in the NHL. Well, Sean, no Hub fellows to thank this week. These are donors who contribute $500 for a lifetime membership. So if you are listening and you'd like to get on the honor roll for one of these shows, we would love to have you join our community for lifetime subscription benefits, a spiffy Hub hat, all kinds of special perks. Please consider joining as a Hub Fellow. You can do that right now on our website, www.thehub.ca. Sean, let's dive into Canadian politics in the week that was. Some indications here that the Carney government is having some challenges finding its footing. Everyone wishes a new prime minister the best. These are no doubt challenging times for Mark Carney in wrapping his head around Ottawa and his arms around some pretty ambitious files and priorities that he's set for himself and for this government as someone who does not have experience in government. What's your sense of what we've seen this week, and what do you think the various stumbles along the way suggest?
Yeah, it's an interesting week, isn't it, Roger? It started with the Prime Minister signing on to a joint statement with his British and French counterpart condemning Israel's ongoing operation in Gaza and threatening quote-unquote action if it didn't reverse course. When the media went to the Prime Minister's office and asked what those actions may be, the government essentially had no answer. We end the week with reporting that the Prime Minister is having a hard time convincing people to join his team as a chief of staff to the Prime Minister, and the typical challenges when it comes to staffing across the various departments. I was speaking to people in Ottawa yesterday, Rudyard, and it sounds like several of the key ministers are operating with what at best can be characterized as skeleton staff. So for a prime minister, it's talked a lot about transformation, Rudyard, who's talked a lot about the level of ambition that the country needs to have, and indeed his government needs to have, He is poised to kick off the parliamentary session next week without the kind of capacity, if I could put it that way, to bring expressions that up to that ambition to in effect translate it from rhetoric to action. And that's just the last point I want to make before I come back to you. The Prime Minister and his team are being lauded, Rudyard, for the decision to release mandate letters to the various ministers that don't have the typical laundry list of concrete proposals for each of them to go about executing. Instead, it sets out 7 priorities for all of the ministers that extend horizontally across the government. And this is being characterized as evidence of a kind of hyper-focused governing agenda. But if you look at it, Rudyard, a lot of these objectives or goals are pretty vague. No one is going to be against, for instance, bringing down costs for Canadians and helping them get ahead. But that sounds more to me like the type of slogans that Mark Carney rightly criticized during the election campaign than a concrete governing agenda. So I guess I'll just wrap up there by saying, it's one thing to communicate ambition. It's another thing to actually bring ambition into a policy agenda. And as Parliament gets set to return on Monday, I think there is evidence that the Prime Minister is struggling to bring that vision into fruition.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's little snapshots, right? It's again the reports that he was even going back and canvassing former senior Liberals from the Trudeau era. Gerald Butts' name was floated, in the Globe and Mail as someone that Mark Carney had reached out to and to discuss a chief of staff role, a similar role that Gerald Butts played in the first Trudeau government as kind of principal secretary, and that people are declining this job. I mean, you would know, you've been in a prime minister's office. This is a brutal job. It's 24/7, and it's kind of all the unglamorous and definitely unsexy parts of running a prime minister's office, though. But I wonder if it also speaks a little bit, Sean, to a characterization of Mark Carney by a lot of his peers over the years as someone who brings a great deal of intensity to their work, to put it charitably, and is somebody that I believe Theo Argydas, our business and economics reporter, there were expressions that were kind of created by staff in the Bank of Canada called being tasered, which was when Mark Carney kind of got you in his crosshairs. In other words, Sean, each leader brings their own style, but when you haven't worked in politics, when you've had these jobs like being a central banker where you basically have one big decision, a handful of times a year. Am I going to increase rates by 25%? Am I going to lower them by 25? Am I not? I'm going to hold. That's very different than the multifactorial, three-dimensional kind of chess that is a PMO. And you have to wonder, again, we hope the best for Mark Carney. Boy, the country needs an effective prime minister. Do we ever? But Sean, this is a very, very steep learning curve for someone coming in from the outside like this, is it not?
Yeah, it's such a great point, Roger. My former boss in the Prime Minister's office, Scott Journo, used to say that the Prime Minister wears several hats or has different identities. He or she's the Prime Minister of a G7 country and the leader of the executive branch of government. They're the leader of their respective parliamentary caucus and registered party. They're a member of parliament. Oftentimes they're a spouse or a parent. And all of these different aspects of a prime minister has to be accounted for by his or her staff, and of course the demands on them and their work. And so I don't think there's any doubt that Prime Minister Carney will be an effective head of the executive branch of government. In a way, he's been training for that job for a long time. And I won't make judgments about him as a spouse or a father. That's out of bounds. But I think it's those other roles and responsibilities that, as you say, are new to him, and involve skills and traits and so on that are oftentimes distinct from those other hats or identities that the prime minister has. And so it is striking to me, Rudyard, as you say, that he's essentially gone back to blasts from the past, according to these reports, to be his chief of staff. And I think it speaks to something we talked about last week. Not only an insecurity on his part on how he executes his responsibilities for some of these different tasks, but also the fact that he doesn't have his own network or power base. He is, for all intents and purposes, renting the Liberal Party of Canada, and I think that means he's ultimately beholden in a way to the people and figures who dominate the party.
Yeah. Yeah, that's an important point. You know, when you come through politics, when you've spent decades in politics, you have allies. You have fellow warriors who have been with you at each and every way. And when you summit, they come with you. And for better or worse, you get them. You get, in a sense, a ready installed group of people that know how the system works, know what your preferences and proclivities are, and act on that. And I think that's partly why we saw that maybe slightly surprising, direction in the cabinet back to so many old Trudeau ministers was, again, Mark Carney is understandably grappling with his inexperience in terms of how the system works. So even though he, I think, paid a political cost for that cabinet in terms of the retreads that came out of the senior Trudeau ministries into his power ministries, it might have been kind of his only option, or it might have spoken to an anxiety and a kind of vulnerability he has. Yeah. Sean, in the remaining moments of the first half of the show, I want to talk a little bit about the national mood, because I think that's another challenge that's being kind of set up for the return of Parliament and the presentation of Mark Carney's kind of governing agenda as initially formatted before we go into the summer break. And that's a sense, Sean, you and I wrote about it this week in the Hub, that the national mood has come off a boil. We may still be a frog in the pot. The water may still be warmer than we like, but you just go by the tail of the tape, the TSX, our major stock market, is at all-time highs. We have, if you look at all the U.S. tariffs applied to all Canadian goods going into the United States, it's in the single digits. We had the news out in the last week since you and I last talked that the Liberals in the dying days of the campaign actually took the retaliatory tariffs, if reports are correct, off most American goods entering Canada. So you put that all together, Sean, and it presents a political challenge, does it not? If that acute anxiety of the campaign, the rhetoric of the 51st state that really understandably amped people up, has dissipated from the president, and most, not all, but most economic indicators suggest that the country is on an even keel. It's certainly not in collapse. Then what do you do? How do you create the momentum for a sweeping agenda in the absence of what Mark Carney characterized in the election was, quote, the greatest crisis of our lifetimes, close quote.
Yes. Yeah, this is something that you've been talking about all week. And one way to think about it, Rudyard, was in the early months of the year, it certainly felt like the Overton window for politics and policy was expanding to levels that we hadn't seen in a long time. You had people talking about moving quickly on eliminating provincial trade barriers and building pipelines and all of these issues that had been the subject of political resistance. And part of Mark Carney's entrance into politics and his early success was that he was someone who had ideas and a voice for that moment, for a world in which Canadians were prepared to kind of throw off the shackles of old thinking and all the rest. And as you say, as President Trump has dissipated a bit from the center of gravity of our politics, you get the sense that the Overton window is starting to close and we're moving back to a kind of normal equilibrium when it comes to politics and policymaking. And so I think it poses real risks for President Carney's self-image as a transformational prime minister. And I think it actually poses some risks for the country. Let me explain why. If the prime minister and his government are so invested, Rudyard, in a narrative of generational crisis, and that crisis itself is no longer top of mind for Canadians, will they be able to resist the temptation not to, in effect, manufacture such a crisis in order to create the conditions not only for their ongoing political success, but to enable the types of changes that Mark Carney has intimated he wants? I think about that in the context of the pending negotiations with the United States. Does the government effectively take a harder line than it might otherwise, because it has this question at the back of its mind? And what about fiscal policy, Rudyard? Are we going to see on the part of the government the type of almost COVID-style support that we saw for individuals and businesses during the pandemic brought forward to the current moment, even if it's no longer the right prescription? And I'll stop in a minute, but let me just emphasize, by virtue of pulling back on those retaliatory tariffs in the election campaign, a step that at the time, had we known, we would have probably supported, he just blew a $20 billion hole into the Liberal Party's platform. And so this tension between crisis and reality, or perceived crisis and reality, I think will be at the backdrop of the government's agenda over the coming months. And how he squares that circle will be important for his own political success, but I would argue for the country as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, we're going to have to figure out, Sean, what the fiscal picture looks like, and we won't really know until now a budget in the fall, which wasn't even a foregone conclusion earlier in the week when Philippe Champagne was in a sense intimating we would have to wait an entire year through to March 2026 to see our first budget. That, to me, again, maybe suggested either that finances were worse than people had thought, because we have been seeing all governments, provincial governments at least, restating much larger deficits than they predicted in their fall financial reviews. And why wouldn't that be the case for the federal government? And I guess that just brings me to a concern here that we're going to end up, in a sense, fighting the last war. We're going to end up deploying debt-financed, large-scale deficit spending to do things that aren't actually the immediate, urgent task that the country needs to face itself with, because there'll be an awful lot of political expediency that, understandably, can be extracted from the perception that there's a crisis. There are checks that can be written. There are industries that can be bailed out. The list can go on, and I think our concern here at the Hub has always been that to avoid a second lost decade, we have to go back to the root causes of the first lost decade. And those are these perennial, somewhat boring, but absolutely necessary problems related to productivity, related to investment, taxation, the structural reform. So I guess what I'm looking for next week with the return of Parliament is, do we see a policy platform that more than just gives a nod to those structural, now increasingly long-term drags on Canadian growth and opportunity, or is it entirely profiled, the policy response to the so-called meet the moment kind of rhetoric of sectoral support, of trade diversification, which again, nice idea in concept, very hard in the execution. So do we see, Sean, and let's have this be the last part for this first half of the show, what do you sense that we see next week? Will it be that more pragmatic, longer term, serious engagement with the structural factors driving Canada's economic decline, or will we be treated to something that seems much more tailored politically and otherwise to the rhetoric of the campaign that we just went through, which again may be ill-suited to where the country finds itself today, just less than a month later?
Yeah, well, great way to set that up. And I worry a lot it's the latter, Rudyard. One of the criticisms of Pierre Poilievre and the Conservative Party over the past several weeks was, once it got itself on a message track about affordability and change, it became impossible for the party to shift course when the underlying economic and political conditions changed. And one wonders if we're going to find that Mark Carney and the Liberal government are in the same boat, that they have so conceptualized their government and its agenda and its priorities and its personnel and all the rest through the lens of this generational crisis vis-a-vis the Trump administration, that as those underlying dynamics change, they will find it hard to themselves adjust and return to some of the more secular challenges that we've been talking and writing about at the Hub. I think that question will be at the heart of how people ought to be analyzing what we see out of the government as early as Tuesday's speech from the throne through the parliamentary session, and then just as importantly in the fall. But if Mark Carney wants to indeed be a transformational prime minister, one of the key questions is he capable of making that so-called pivot, which is a word that's entered our political lexicon over so far in 2025.
Yeah. Well, Sean, let's say goodbye to our complimentary listeners and viewers. Thank you for tuning into this, the first half of the roundtable. If you want the entire program, you can join as a Hub hero. It's only $1 a week. It's the best deal in town. You get all of our best podcasts, including In Conversation with David Frum, at full length, along with all of our paid content on our website. And you support our independent journalism. The Hub does not accept government subsidies for its news and analysis, and we can only do that as a result of the support of our Hub heroes and Hub fellows. So please sign up now at www.thehub.ca. We'll say goodbye to you and back in a moment with our Hub donors.